Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e5. Pawn f2 to f4. Pawn d7 to d5. Pawn e4 takes d5. Pawn e5 to e4. Pawn d2 to d3. Knight g8 to f6. Pawn d3 takes e4. Knight f6 takes e4. Queen d1 to d3. Knight e4 to f6. Knight b1 to c3. Bishop f8 to c5. Queen d3 to c4. Queen d8 to e7, check. Bishop f1 to e2. Bishop c8 to f5. Knight c3 to a4. Bishop c5 to d6. Queen c4 to b5, check. Knight b8 to d7. Queen b5 takes b7. Castle kingside. Pawn c2 to c4. Bishop f5 to e4. King e1 to f1. Bishop e4 takes g2, check. King f1 takes g2. Queen e7 to e4, check. Bishop e2 to f3. Queen e4 to c2, check. Knight g1 to e2. Queen c2 takes a4. Pawn b2 to b3. Queen a4 to a5. Queen b7 to c6. Rook a8 to b8. Bishop c1 to e3. Knight d7 to c5. Rook h1 to b1. Knight f6 to d7. Pawn b3 to b4. Rook b8 takes b4. Bishop e3 to d2. Rook b4 takes b1. Bishop d2 takes a5. Rook b1 takes a1. Bishop a5 takes c7. Bishop d6 takes c7. Queen c6 takes c7. Rook a1 takes a2. Bishop f3 to g4. Pawn f7 to f5. Bishop g4 to f3. King g8 to h8. Pawn d5 to d6. Rook a2 to c2. King g2 to f1. Rook c2 takes c4. Bishop f3 to c6. Knight d7 to f6. Bishop c6 to b5. Knight f6 to d5. Queen c7 takes a7. Rook c4 to c2. Pawn d6 to d7. Rook f8 to d8. Queen a7 to a5. Knight c5 to a6. Queen a5 to a6. Knight d5 to c7. Queen a6 to d6. Rook c2 to c5. Bishop b5 to c6. Rook c5 to c2. Pawn h2 to h4. Rook d8 to b8. Pawn h4 to h5. Pawn h7 to h6. Bishop c6 to f3. King h8 to h7. King f1 to e1. Rook c2 to a2. Queen d6 to e5. Rook b8 to b1, check. King e1 to f2. Rook b1 to d1. Queen e5 takes f5, check. King h7 to g8. Bishop f3 to g4. Rook a2 to a6. Queen f5 to e5. Rook d1 takes d7. King f2 to e1. King g8 to f8. Bishop g4 to f3. Rook a6 to d6. Knight e2 to c3. Knight e6 to d4. King e1 to f2. Knight c7 to e6. King f2 to g2. Knight d4 takes f3. King g2 takes f3. Knight e6 to d4, check. King f3 to g2. King f8 to f7. Queen e5 to e4. King f7 to f8. Queen e4 to e5. Rook d6 to e6. Queen e5 to b8, check. King f8 to e7. Queen b8 to a8. Rook e6 to d6. Queen a8 to e4, check. King e7 to f7. King g2 to f2. Rook d6 to e6. Queen e4 to h7. Rook e6 to c6. Queen h7 to d3. Rook c6 to c5. Queen d3 to g6, check. King f7 to f8. Knight c3 to e4. Rook c5 to c2, check. King f2 to f1. Rook c2 to c1, check. King f1 to f2. Rook c1 to c6. Queen g6 to h7. Rook c6 to c2, check. King f2 to g3. Rook d7 to f7. Queen h7 to h8, check. King f8 to e7. Queen h8 to a8. Knight d4 to e2, check. King g3 to f3. Knight e2 takes f4. Queen a8 to a7, check. King e7 to e6. Queen a7 to a6, check. King e6 to d7. Queen a6 to d6, check. King d7 to c8. Queen d6 to a6, check. King c8 to d8. Queen a6 to d6, check. King d8 to c8. Queen d6 to a6, check. King c8 to d7. Queen a6 to d6, check. King d7 to c8. The game is a draw.